is a guy named Jim Derleth. And I guess, had some background in the military prior, but it doesn't seem like much. Um, but starting in 2004, he got his way into being the USAID's basically top stability advisor. So basically, he ended up being the guy in the U.S. Agency for International Development, kind of guiding policy for how to stabilize these conflict regions that we were in, Afghanistan and Iraq. Um, and he didn't seem like the brightest bulb. He would come, he in particular, just something about him just was not impressive, um, to me at least. Kind of an egghead, a little bit aloof. And what USAID was mostly concerned about is, I think we've talked about this before, but the military started getting allocated tons and tons of money, what they called CERT, the Commander's Emergency Response Program. And And this money first was like Saddam's like treasure hoard. Effectively, it was like we happened upon the treasury, and we're spending that willy nilly. And then when that ran out a year later, they Congress started appropriating millions and millions of dollars for the military to use for things like, well, first of all, for damages, for salacious claims, for when we killed somebody or destroyed something we shouldn't have destroyed, but also to do projects, to build bridges and soccer fields and hospitals and all kinds of snap nonsense. But a lot of what was driving it was just it depended on the particular whims, interests, knowledge, and abilities of whatever officer was there with the money. Whatever military officer in that area was designated as the contracting. That doesn't matter. The Not the paying agent, but the ordering officer, or whatever the term we had for it was. Um, Whoever that was would kind of be the guy, and sometimes it would be a civil affairs guy like me, or sometimes it would be just an infantry officer who got stuck with had this money and could do with it kind of as they pleased up to a certain limit, and then if you had a better, bigger idea, you just had to get your boss or your boss's boss to approve that you spending more money on it. But this could led to kind of a lot of random things being done. One area is building soccer fields because they think that's a good idea, and another place is building schools because they seem to think that's a good idea, and another place is building a slaughterhouse because they don't like seeing animals slaughtered on the streets in Ramadi. So they're like, oh, we should build a common slaughterhouse and have the sheikh of the area be in charge of it. And everyone hates the sheikh, and he's taking kickbacks and bribes. So they didn't like that. They didn't like that it didn't seem to be systematized. So he got assigned as the military coordinator from USAID and came up with this system to collect data, to drive projects. And the idea was that what they need is for everyone, idea he cooked up is for everyone to go out and only ask these four questions. Like, not have these discussions with a key leader, oh, the sheikh says you should do this with the money or whatever. But instead, that you should be going out and asking everyone only four questions. Has the population changed in your village? Why? What is the biggest problem in your village? Why? Who do you believe could solve your problem? Why? And what should be done first to solve the problem? And through doing this, you were supposed to collect kind of clean data. You know what I mean? The that the idea was the population question was supposed to be an indicator of instability. If people were getting out of Dodge, that's supposed to indicate that there's a problem there. And if people are resettling in that area, that's supposed to indicate that this problem is whatever things are improving in that area. So basically, an area where the population's grown, you don't focus your efforts there. And in areas where the population has dropped, you focus your efforts there. And then asking people what's the biggest problem, and who can solve it, who should you turn to, and then what can be done first. But what you got out of this mostly, if you did do these, they didn't want they were very adamant about not asking any follow-up questions or any other guiding questions or having a real genuine conversation, which of course didn't really contribute well to coin or really engaging on a human level with people. So a lot of people, myself included, didn't really do it that way. We would talk to people and work our way around to the question, but that of course would not be clean data, and USAID didn't like that. Um, but what you were supposed to do with this then is kind of fill it all in and aggregate it upwards. But from what you would get from the people is you would get an honest answer about whether the population's changed. You know what I mean? A general up or down, but a lot of them are what is this question? And then the biggest problem, 90% of them would say security or you guys or insurgents, and that wasn't really useful to guide anything, you know? Um, and then who do you believe could solve the problem? You would get, I don't know, you guys, whoever's got the biggest gun, like 90% of the time, this is what you got. And then what should be done first would be this simple, like, I don't know, get rid of the bad guys. So you would just get tons and tons of noise with it. And then worse
Well,
than, and
like,
go ahead.
just curious, did the Afghans like take it very seriously? I would guess like if some like cop came around to my door and started asking me like, what are the problems in your neighborhood? My response is you, just because like you're the person that's bothering me right now. It like, and I mean, I don't know, maybe like the people of Afghanistan, like when your occupier is asking you, maybe like you do take it a little bit more serious or
Well,
something like that. Or like, could people, was there like any manipulation? Maybe like if somebody kind of knew what was going on and was in a leadership position, I would have to imagine that like if they could like tell it, like figured out like the algorithm here, that
mhm.
would be pretty easy to manipulate.
Yeah, so they definitely generally didn't take it serious. Well, what happened very quickly with this is some people that bought into it, it did give the military and the Marines, if they bought into it or were told to buy into it by their boss, this like kind of actionable, simple enough item to do, assuming they could get the interpreters. So what you got was a lot of Marines going around for a while while this was being preached, was just like going out and collecting dozens of these from every person they bumped into on a patrol. And and first of all, it kind of like, so what you would get was a lot of like 15 questionnaires from the same area from every random schmo off the street. And also, but the next patrol is going to bump into the same people, and you'd have like everybody within a quarter-mile radius of a base would have been asked this question 50 times in a month. And then when a new unit comes in all over again, and when a new unit comes in all over again, which they might regard as a good thing, like the data dinks would regard it as a good thing because they could judge over time. You know what I mean? But the reality was that most of this data didn't go anywhere. It didn't get sent, it didn't make its way up. Or if it did, whoever it made its way up to was like, I don't know what to do with all this. This is just, I have a giant I have this enormous Excel spreadsheet full of questionnaire responses. And unless you're like the world's biggest Excel nerd that can make pie charts and suss it out for you, and you can break it down by locality and all kinds of crazy stuff, you know, nothing really could be done with it. It
Yeah.
just ended up being collection for collection's sake, and Marines being sent out on patrols. And I'm sure Marines lost their life just because their boss told them go out and get 10 TCAF interviews. That's what it was called. It was TCAF, Tactical Conflict Assessment Planning Framework.
So
Um,
just two quick questions. I guess the
sure.
first one is you said that if people are leaving or going, they assume that was a sign that things were either bad or good, depending. Did
Mhm.
you find that to be like true at all, or was there any truth to it, or was it just like a
I
bad assumption?
I think it's reasonable. I couldn't say for sure, but I think it was reasonable to conclude that, like, but also one thing, it would tell you something about the area. Like, people definitely, when I was doing this in this one random place north of a little Nothingville fob called Fiddler's Green. It's where they kind of parked the artillery in the desert, kind of like they picked a spot sort of in the desert, equidistant from the northernmost Marines and the southernmost Marines, so that they could do fire support in either direction, kind of. And we were going out from there and asking people, and they were like resettling near some like drainage ditch, and they said they had a land claim there from like Daoud Khan, like in the 50s or something like that. Their grandfather had a land claim there, and they finally decided to move there. But like, I get it was reasonable to say they left somewhere else that sucked and came there because this was a dump. There wasn't any good reason to just like pack up and move and live in a shanty. So it gave you an idea that things were bad somewhere else and relatively more peaceful here. So I think it was a reasonable. I think that part was reasonable, and then
Okay.
from there, but um, I'd be curious if other people had like different experiences, but I think it's reasonable. At least the first question was a reasonable way to like get an idea. But
So, and then another question I had, just that I think is like maybe is kind of on the track that you were going, where that this could have been or maybe was dangerous for Marines who were sent out to go get this information, because you're in a position where you could be easily attacked, I'm sure, and at
yeah,
the
you'd
height of
have
the
to.
insurgency, right? So, was there any possibility that like the commanders or the Marines would just like make it up? Because it seems like that's probably what I would do.
Yeah, I mean, well, that was it. Like, so a lot of people like to do this, you'd have to stop your patrol and sit down. This is supposed to be good counterinsurgency, Stop your patrol, maybe take your helmet off, sit down, talk, have a cup of tea if you have time. Of course, while I'm doing that, the Marines that are pulling security are like, "How long do we have to be here?" And they're getting antsy. This is getting dangerous, and they would be telling me you only have like 5 minutes max. And then, is that like they we got to get out of here? We can't just sit here all day, kind of stuff. And if it was somebody who wasn't really interested in doing that or taking those risks, if it wasn't me and it was more of my job to be doing that, all right, and also getting access to an interpreter was not easy. Like civil affairs guys, we always had an interpreter more or less, so like 1 to 1. I had my own interpreter more or less, but an infantry squad has one interpreter, or one like the platoon might have one interpreter that they're sharing because the interpreters don't want to work for the infantry. They would always ask to be transferred from. It's dangerous and it sucks because you're going on long patrols all the time. So it was a rare guy that really wanted to be out there doing that, and they would get fatigued and not want to deal with it. So so they couldn't send them out on every single patrol. Um, and you would get that aspect of them maybe faking it or just not bothering with it, or I know that happened. And you would also get the aspect. The other thing too is a lot of Marines probably weren't paying attention exactly, and they didn't have the exact script. So there's a difference between how many people. There's a small but important difference between has the population changed and what's the population in the village. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
Which is
yeah,
what I know Marines would ask. And then it's like, dude, if you asked me how many people lived on my block, I wouldn't have a clue.
right.
You know what I mean? If
Like,
you asked
yeah,
me how
how
many
many
people
people
lived in
live
my
in my
apartment,
apartment complex? Yeah, I have
no
no
idea.
estimate.
And the same's true for people in, like, they might know each other a little better, like in these little agricultural villages, but not by like they're not gonna give you a count. Like a rough idea that there's more people here is what they're going for, but even then, like, who really knows? Like, a new couple moved in down the street and that house is vacant now. I don't know. Like,
Or I could have just imagined if somebody asked myself and my fiance how many people lived in our apartment complex, that there may be like a zero added to hers versus mine would be would be my guess. You know what I mean?
yeah.
But I really don't, like, I could be the wrong one on it. But I'm just saying that, like, I think two people who are neighbors could give wildly different answers. And so, like,
Yeah.
if you're asking people one day, you get two guys that say 500, and the next guy says 700. They, oh my god, the population's spiking, and it could just be bad estimates.
Yeah, which is why it was supposed to be has it changed, But
Right.
but Marines that would get lost in the translation, depending who you have, because they would get in a routine of asking this question a certain way or a rhythm with their interpreter. And if they're asking how many people live here, you would get just garbage back. You know what I mean? And honestly, I don't even know who. I thank God I didn't have to be the one collecting it. But even then, whoever was stuck like collecting it, I doubt that they could deal with most of the garbage they were being fed data wise. You know what I
Right.
mean?
Right.
Which is again sort of talking about before, like how he cooked up this idea, but he could definitely just say, well, they didn't do it right. You know what I mean? But if your idea can't work with the people that are supposed to implement it, then what good is it really? So that was like his TCAF was his big bright idea. And I do wonder how many Marines did get hurt doing it. Um, and like I said, it was supposed to drive stability, like the stability operations, and say this is where we need to focus, and these are the kinds of projects we need to do here, locally driven, data driven. But in reality, it was just a huge crap project, waste of time. And he went. Now, granted, I think he was on a government salary at least, so he wasn't making out like a bandit exactly. But he went around from unit to unit for a few years, spending a week or at least a few days of every unit's life in their training cycle getting ready to go, being like, you have to do this TCAF thing and let me teach you what it is and why it's great, you know? And you'd have to sit through these classes, and 90% of Marines were 99% were rolling their eyes like, what in the hell is this? I'm supposed to be fighting a war and you want me to take a survey, like be a friggin' census collector.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
And did you guys have like electronic devices to collect on, where it was a handwritten? Because just
Handwritten
for
notes.
anybody who was looking, it looks like it's a one page, maybe a little bit longer, maybe it's a little bit more than like a 8 by 11. But not that like the boxes look like they're the normal size piece of paper, like maybe a quarter of the page. Like I would guess that like most soldiers, like once the box was full, they stopped writing, and so even
They,
some like person like
two or
did
three
like
words of
have an
gibberish.
insightful thing to say, they're
Mm-hmm.
not like really getting it down probably.
Yeah,
All
yeah,
right.
absolutely. And this is all going through an interpreter too. And an interpreter who often doesn't even speak the same language or doesn't want to be there. Um, you know, regards the local as a podunk loser. You know what I mean?
Right.
Um, all of that stuff that we really couldn't even suss out. So yeah, and he has moved on. Jim Derleth, he well recently presented at the Modern War Institute at West Point about the Army's transition in the global environment, and he did have some interesting things to. This is interesting though, because he gave a talk basically about well, this is an interesting question. What was the most successful military operation in the last like 10 years? And this was to a bunch of West Point students during his speaker series, and he argues that it was the Russian takeover of Crimea because it was went without a shot. You know what I mean? That it was. I feel like Scott Horton might like hearing that. You know what I mean? That basically just turn
There's
around,
a
surrender,
level of
go home.
reality to that you could appreciate. Like that's a decent like pick of things like you got to pick from. At least he wasn't like the U.S. campaign against Assad in Syria or like against Gaddafi or something like that. Is he up to anything else other than talking at West Point?
He's the professor of irregular warfare at the George C. Marshall Security Studies Center at Hohenfels area, which is Hohenfels area, as I understand, is one of the biggest training areas in Europe. It used to be where basically practice for the breakout of the Cold War happened every few months.
Okay.
Um, with this giant training area, and he's the professor of irregular warfare there, which is interesting because I don't know that they anticipate much of that but I'm not exactly clear what he beyond that. It's not clear what he's doing there.
Well, this is something that I read in, I think, Douglas McGregor's piece either yesterday or today at the American Conservative, where he's kind of talking about the rot within like the upper levels of the military, and you have this guy, right, who like yeah, maybe this was a well intentioned plan, maybe like he really thought like this was going to make a difference, but it was clearly a waste, right,
Mm-hmm,
and so at best you got to move this guy on, right? Like
mm-hmm,
he can't be training the next generation or whatever of soldiers because he's a loser. Like
mm-hmm,
that's like just the way like he was wrong, and like him being wrong was like dangerous, for Afghans definitely, but probably for you Marines as well. So
mm-hmm.
I don't know. It's just it's frustrating
Yeah,
that like so many of these people that fail in like an organization that kind of like prides itself on accountability don't actually take any accountability for anything.
yeah, and especially for like the civilian kind of advisor, like you go from your military role to being the civilian advisor type role, and you can kind of just spout off as long as you can, get in the right person's ear and have them believe that you have all the answers, then you can just kind of coast along. And if you fail, you can just like we said, you can blame it on everyone else for not doing it right.